Anyway, my name is Edwin Bridges, and I have been doing various flora and ecological projects in Florida and the southeastern U.S. for most of my career.
So
and
Edwin, get that microphone right on your face.
Oh no.
Sorry, but you didn't hear.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Sounds the same to me. I've been doing floristic and ecological projects for most of my career, ever since the 1970s. And for about the last 30 years, I've concentrated that work mostly in the state of Florida. And as Mandy explained, sometimes I was living and working full-time in the state, and other times I've been sort of running around the country and coming back here as often as I could. I've been assembling a lot of information over that period of time, and you'll see some examples of that as I go through the slides. But I thought it was about time to try to put that together into something that was more coherent and could be utilized by a larger number of people that would have access to the information, because we would present it in a systematic and usable format, whether that's on the web or in an application or in something you could download and print out yourself, but unlikely to ever be a printed volume or printed set of volumes. The impetus for getting going with that now is a project that was started by Alan Weekly about 15 or 20 years ago on the flora of the southeastern United States. For most of the iteration of that flora, it did not include anything, it did not include Florida. And then it gradually included North Florida. Yes. And then on this last edition in 2020, for the first time, this southeastern flora, which is the only modern flora that really covers the state of Florida and covers all families, covers the entire state and is divided Florida into 4 biogeographic regions in order to make that easier for use. So using that as the baseline for this, we're going to be amplifying that in order to make the data and the keys and the descriptions in that more specific to the actual state of Florida. We're doing the adjustments. Okay. Got it. Yeah, I can't see it all, but maybe. No. The first word in the upper left column should be waif. For each one of the species in the flora of the southeastern United States, there are little distribution maps to make it easier for people to understand the distribution and how common or rare they are in each of these many different regions that the flora covers. And also a little rosette at the bottom right of the map, which indicates where it's found outside of this region. In this case, Cherokeeensis is found somewhat to the west. Narthecia montanum is found nowhere else, since it's extirpated and it's probably extinct. So with this level of understanding of the flora by regions, you can see that it's going to make it possible to make a flora from that includes just the region you're interested in, and then be able to work with the way that you narrow down keys and descriptions to just be the region that you're talking about. Yeah, and that should have, oop, you're missing the left list of family names. Well, everybody at home can see all this, so there was an advantage to staying home. The largest families in Florida is really a very diverse state. There's currently, according to our estimate, there are 4,884 native or naturalized species in the state, of which 3,178 are native. But if you look at what the largest families are, which is the left column you can't see, they're grasses, sedges, aster family, the things that you dread kind of trying to identify, because those really are the most diverse. They are difficult to work with. And when you look at the largest genera, which you can see in the right column, 3 of the top 4 are, the top 3 are all sedges. Carex, Cyperus, and Rincospora. And those require some learning specialized terms and knowing which you have to choose from. So if we can narrow down those choices by habitats and by regions of the state, it can make it easier to know which one you're likely to see in a particular community type in a particular region, and you aren't having to really choose between all 80 or 70. And there's an example of those statistics. And again, now I narrowed that down just now to central peninsular Florida. And I really do want to focus on the left column, which is the ones we're working with. With central peninsular Florida, as we're defining it, has 1,900 native species and a total of almost 2,900 species. That's almost 1,000 non-natives, of course. And again, the same families are the most common ones. And so you can see that there's actually a lot of plants that we're dealing with here, and we really need to narrow that down and work with it in order to make that usable for people. This is how the keys are structured. And of course, you can see the numbered couplets on the very left-hand side of the screen go 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 9, which you can't see, can you? At least I can't see it.
Sorry, I researched how, but I don't know the report, so sorry. Okay.
And so this is an example of what one of the keys looks like in the weekly flora. And it includes only those species in the state, even though the key is written as if it's for the entire Southeast. It just leaves out the characters you need in order to identify the ones that you're not going to find. So it simplifies it already just for the state. Well, and it also, again, like we're seeing, it has these little distribution maps, and this is all a free download. It's easy to download from the website. If you don't have the information already, I can make sure you have it. I'm going to focus on one of these as an example of how to collect the information that we're looking at for the ecology part of the flora. I'm going to focus on Ericolon ravenellii. How many in here have seen Ericolon ravenellii? Nope. Okay, one person that I showed it to. All right. First, I'll talk about the flora regions. At least you can see Central Florida on here is what we're calling. It's kind of an arbitrary division, but it's that way because of history as much as anything else. If you know about the Institute for Regional Conservation in South Florida, they've done some of this kind of work already for the southernmost 10 counties. And so there is a floristic database of South Florida that I've got the address there for, that you can actually access and find ecological information and natives for your neighborhood and things like that from that website, where they've done an inventory of the southernmost 10 counties. Weekly's 2015 Flora edition included what I'm calling Panhandle and North as North Florida. And so the counties left in between become by default Central Florida, which is not a bad definition. Really the line probably should go through Marion County if I had to do it without using county boundaries, because the north part of Marion County is like North Florida and the south part is definitely central. But the rest of them make a lot of sense to me as kind of geographic divisions that we can use county lines for convenience as a means of summarizing. So in the meantime, I had been doing things like this. This actually is from 1994 on the same group of plants for what was going to be a multi-volume Flora of Florida. Well, that project went a different direction than I wanted to go. And so, but I have all my work for it still, and I want to put that into this format as well. You'll notice it provides much more information about the habitats and the ecology of each species. I've also been doing a lot of posting online of species and their descriptions and how to identify them. This is that Ericolon ravenellii, and the long post to the long description to the left of it is what I put in with it as part of a Facebook post with these illustrations to show its history, where to find it, how to find it, what its characters were, what kind of habitat you'd find it in. I anticipate that we'll have this kind of information for every species, every native species in the state, and probably many of the naturalized ones by the time we're done with this project. And to show that I had more to choose from, I just, have the description there of its species on the left, more about its habitat and distribution, and some photos I have to choose from in terms of which ones I'm going to use to illustrate just this particular one. But then I go to another resource such as iNaturalist. How many have used iNaturalist for using observations? Yeah, it's a good means of documenting what you see in the field at what locations. And then other people can review that. They can actually identify the plant for you if there was any doubt about whether you had the correct identification. And often those identifications can happen within a matter of minutes, depending on what it's done. But this is the Ericolin ravenellii worldwide observations. 4 as how many times this has been observed on iNaturalist. And three of those are by Jay Horn, who is a professor at FGCU. So we don't have a lot of records out there for this plant. This is what you'd see if you went to the IRC database, the Floristic Inventory of South Florida. Again, it's got where the plant occurs. And in this case, notice on the right, which you can see, it indicates which natural areas it's been known from and which ones where it's maybe no longer present. This one is probably present in most of the ones it's historically known and what counties those represent. And based upon all of that, they said this was rare in South Florida. This is the ratings. Oh, I need the ones to the left very much for the people in the room. SFX is the top thing, which means extirpated or extinct in the region. This is adapted from the NatureServe ranking system for GNS ranks for all species globally and state ranked. So SFX, obviously extirpated or extinct in that region. SFH, historical only in the region. SF1, critically imperiled, probably 5 or fewer occurrences and threatened with probably local extinction due to factors of rarity. SF2, imperiled, 6 to 20 occurrences in the region. SF3, rare, probably less than 100 occurrences and not that many individuals. Less, they say, in this case, less than 10,000 if that can be determined. Then you can see the SF4 and SF5, things where you can know by the number of records and where you see them that those plants are apparently secure or secure in that region. It's our intention to do these rankings for all 3 of the other regions of Florida that in the same manner as they are been done for South Florida. So when I do that for Ericolin ravenellii, there's its county distribution map in the state. It's known from Orange County. It is already ranked by NatureServe as G3, globally rare, S3, state rare. South Carolina, where the type locality is, historical, never been relocated in over 100 years. SF3 is what South Florida ranked it, rare. 2 for Central Florida. It's a little rarer than that. It would be hard for people to go out and find 20 occurrences unless they knew exactly where to go.
So where would you go for this species in Orange County?
I would go to the calcareous wet savannas in Tosahatchee.
Oh, really?
Yes. I'd try to find like an ecotone between a wet prairie and the calcareous wet savannas that on those alpha sols in Tosahatchee State Reserve as a good place to look. It is a calciphile. And you know the calciphiles are relatively restricted unless you're in the right habitats. And a wetland calciphile is going to be restricted to those wetland calcareous prairies or savannas. Actually, I don't know if I've seen it there or not, and I don't know if I should have looked to see if that's where the record's from. It might be. Then a little rarer in North Florida and quite rare in the peninsula. I have seen it probably only 1 or 2 times in the Panhandle. I've only seen it 1 or 2 times in coastal Wakulla County myself, down near St. Mark's. So as a summary of what this project is going to have in it, we're going to use that framework that the weekly 2020 Flora provides to have detailed habitat information for Florida as a whole and the specific differences between the 4 regions, rarity or commonness in each of the 4 regions, given these species rankings that I've just talked about, identification tips of how to tell them apart, how to tell apart similar species, like some of us were discussing earlier, what characters separate 2 species that you might not encounter if you just looked at the key between them, and vegetative characters. For instance, Alan Weekly has written a vegetative key to most of the Ericaceae, the heath family, where you don't really have to have the flowers or fruits to get to genus within the family, which actually makes it a little easier since sometimes you don't know when you see that flower, is the fruit going to be a berry or a capsule. And then something else that I'm going to talk about a little later called coefficient of conservatism for each species. Photos, links to photos to go illustrate the characters and illustrate the basic features of each species. And as a start, I've got about 50,000 assembled of mine that I can use, but they're certainly going to need more than that. And then we're going to work towards having that whole key and flora a visual entry key, which I'm going to talk about a little later, about the fact that you don't have to go to a written key to start identifying plants. You can actually just answer questions about what plants you have, such as, are the leaves opposite? Is it a tree, a shrub, a vine, a grass-like plant, etc. And as you answer the questions, the number of choices that are available narrow down. And of course, if you know location and habitat, it can narrow it down as well. And then we're going to make sure that we rework the keys to make them more specific to the Florida species in those genera, particularly in the larger groups, where let's say the whole Southeast might have 400 species in that genus, and we may only have 80. One state that has done a lot of this already is California. So these are 3 screens from the Cal Flora website, indicating how you can dig down through the layers of data to find information about a specific species that links to distribution maps, habitat, location, descriptions, pictures, etc. And all of that, you could drill down even further and get more information, like which specimens there are of it. So all of that's integrated on that site. When I was talking about the integrated, the multi-entry keys, this is something that is available for New England already. It's called a simple ID key on the website Go Botany. And if you're ever in New England trying to identify plants, this works really well for identifying most species of the region, including going down to difficult to identify groups. And so you can keep answering questions and get down to what specific species of carex you're seeing. In which case, I use that as an example of their species information screen for one species in that. This has also been done through Alan Weekly and some developers in an application called Flora of Virginia, where this the entire flora of the state of Virginia is available as an interactive key on a mobile device. So you actually have the interactive key, you have the descriptions, you have the photos all available through that. Unfortunately, there's not a web version for me to show as a demonstration, but instead there's the digital atlas of the Flora of Virginia, which also has the links to the illustrations and more about the descriptions of habitat. And then one more state example was Michigan, which has their whole flora key as an online key. So as you click through it, you're clicking to the genera and then into the species under each heading to the left. And then you end up getting to which species you're interested in, and it'll give you the distribution and the habitat. And up near the top, it's got something called coefficient of conservatism, which I mentioned as point number 4 in the flora. So this is the first time we've encountered that in one of these websites we're talking about. The coefficient of conservatism is a measure of how likely that species is to be indicator of high quality habitat or part of a natural flora assemblage that's not been altered by disturbance. So species that are found only in fairly undisturbed areas get very high coefficients of conservatism. Those that are the weedy native, kind of the native weeds, get the lowest, because you'd find them at least as often, probably more often, in disturbed areas than in natural areas. And these were developed in order to set conservation priorities. So that when you were looking at comparing different areas that had, let's say 2 different 20-acre patches of prairie, you could look to see which species were present, and that had the ones that were the most conservative to the prairies probably indicated that had the best chances of being viable in the long term. And we've used this several times over the years, and it's gotten very popular in some regions as a means of assessing restoration success or in doing ecological monitoring on more than just a species diversity level. So the states that are shaded have at least some of their flora with those coefficients of conservatism assigned. The entire South Florida flora has been done this way, but only a small part of the flora of actually the other southeastern states, the ones that are crosshatched in Georgia and Florida, North Florida there, are part of a wetland set that was done by a region-wide assessment, and I don't think it's as specific to the state as it probably needs to be. However, it's been done, and I've used it. In this case, this graph is, each circle represents a different natural area polygon in Osceola and Polk County, actually all within the Upper Lakes Basin watershed, which now is mostly part of Lake Marion Creek Wildlife Management Area, but part of it's still like the Osceola County Environmental Education Center and a few other properties. And it indicates that species diversity, the total number, doesn't necessarily correlate with quality. The ones that were disturbed areas, like that WD, upland disturbed, wetland disturbed, had high diversity, but low quality index, whereas hydric hammocks and mesic hammocks had high diversity and were high quality index. Whereas in the other contrast, scrubs, particularly scrubs dominated by xeric oaks, even some xeric hammocks and things like that, had low numbers of species, but those species themselves were high indicators of quality, so they stand out as higher average than would be expected by the number of species. I've got other analyses of this, but I just put one in as an example. This represents about 150 survey sites in a small area. So you can start ranking all of the species of the state as a way of starting this. And this is my preliminary ranking in one genus. So the left-hand side is one set of the species of the genus Rhynchospora, and then it continues on the right-hand side with the rest of the genus. So for the state and the global rank, the state rank, and then each of the 4 regions, whether I would assign it a state, South Florida, Central Florida, North Florida, Panhandle Florida, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. In some cases, there actually turns out there's even fewer records than that. So when I started looking at this, I found there's no recent records of even some species. So one example is Rhynchospora punctata, which at this point we consider state historical. It was last seen in the state in 1998. It could still be there, but someone would have to go look. But when you look at that as being the total range of the plant, the chances are not very likely that you're going to find it far outside that range, and it may be difficult to find anymore. We'll go back to iNaturalist as a way of doing and collecting information. I'm actually utilizing iNaturalist a lot to assemble and collect observations that people are making throughout the state to help in that analysis of how common is something really. Because you'd think if something's a common plant, people should be finding it a lot of times, and they'd be photographing it and posting it. So, something with like 400 or 500 records, I'd say that's pretty common. But if it has 1 or 2, then I'll go wonder, why is no one seeing this? Is it simply they're not going to the right places? Is it not that obvious? Or if it is a very obvious plant, obviously then it's very rare. And so we're looking to see how it's basically a way of looking at how the modern flora differs from the historical flora. Historical flora has really been built up through 150 or more years of collecting specimens from various counties, and usually with one specimen per county being enough to say, okay, it's in that county, we move on, it's documented. Well, that tells us nothing about whether it's still in that county. So we're trying to work on that level of information using iNaturalist as another one of these sources. And I've started iNaturalist, I've started about 50 of these projects to assemble this information. There are some for county level projects for all the counties of North and Central Florida, as well as projects for various natural areas, particularly the larger state-owned and federal-owned pieces of land. And each one of those, I can look to see what's the most observed species, who's out there looking. Then I can send them hints as to what to go look for. And it becomes like an army of people that can help assemble this information. And some of them have jumped right in and are doing it. This is an example of what one of those projects would look like when it's displayed in iNaturalist. These are all the plant observation records in iNaturalist from the Ecological National Forest as of about a month or two ago, about 5,400 of them. You notice there's two. People are sometimes worried about sharing that information because it might be something rare. Well, in this map, the solid symbols are unobscured locations for things that aren't rare. All those open circles are obscured locations. It means it's somewhere in a certain distance around that point, but that point isn't where it really is. And so no one can use that point to relocate the plant any more than they could by just knowing it was in the county. So you can post obscured ones, and if you're posting them within a project, you can actually allow the curator of the project to know where it is, but not the public. And that's how many of the projects on iNaturalist that were set up by the Florida Wildlife Commission were set up, so they could track this information without making it all public. And also the Florida Natural Areas Inventory has also set up one for rare plants the same way, and I'm a curator of that project so that I can see what's going on and work on what's new and what's not new. And again, these have been set up for many projects. This is an example I did for the Withlacoochee, for one of the tracks of the Withlacoochee State Forest, which again already had, at the time we just started this, over 730 observations of plants that had already been made without people going out and actually targeting it based upon this, looking for this information. And where we're going to go on Saturday, the Lake Wells Ridge State Forest Arbuckle Track has almost 1,000 plant observations already. And I've highlighted a search that you can do within the data of iNaturalist. In this case, I highlighted just the observations of Ringtospora megaplumosa, which we will see on the field trip, which is an endemic of Central Florida. It's found nowhere else except this region. But the most comprehensive of all the iNaturalist projects in Florida is split oak. When I even just narrow it down to plants, there's 3,381 plant observations as of a few days ago, 5,600 total observations, including plants and animals. And they represent 406 species, which probably is getting really pretty close to the full flora of that site. It's probably going to get increasingly difficult to add any more native plants to a list of 406 from that sized area. Now, there'll still be some more found, but I would say that that's relatively complete as of the point where you could call it equivalent to a published flora based just on photos that could be identified to species, and they're accurately identified. And in this little thing, it says, what were the last so many observations? And you see, oh, yep, that should be there. I know Stenanthium densum made the last 5. Now, what are some of the really rare plants of Central Florida that will come out of this kind of a study? There's some already. They're so obviously really rare in Central Florida that I have to put them up just as examples of a priori rare. One is Schwalbe Americana. I've seen that in Florida twice, but only in the Western Panhandle. I've seen it in Georgia, but as far as I know, it was last seen in Central Florida in 1948, unless somebody has a more recent observation. It was last seen in North Florida in 1940. But again, I know of 2 or 3 sites in the Western Panhandle where it still exists, and it's federally listed G2 S1, but would be considered extirpated from Central Florida. So this is something we've already lost, apparently, unless someone can find the right habitat, find the right conditions, and rediscover it in what was basically kind of, from a distance, it just looks like a normal longleaf pine savanna, but it was the seepage between a sandhill community and a seepage slope. And you almost never see sandhills and seepage slopes next to each other in Central Florida anymore. So that's the kind of herbaceous seepage slopes at that. Slightly upslope from Sternanthium densum is another clue. I'm going to go through the genus Platanthera as another set of examples of this type of rarity. Probably the most common Platanthera in Central and South Florida is Platantheronivia, which people should know very well. And I put up about 4 or 5 examples of different range information. I hope you can see some of there and what the plant looks like. The iNaturalist one is the map in the top center, showing that people are finding it. It's ranked already by the national and state as G5 S3, but I think maybe it might be an S4. It might not be rare statewide enough to say that. It's rare in South Florida, but I think it's at least a 3 in Central, North, and Panhandle, where you could go out and find 20 or more locations, maybe 100 locations of this plant. The next rarest one would be Platanthera ciliaris, the orange fringed orchid is what I would call it. How many have seen that in Central Florida? Walter and a couple other people. It is out there, but you have to look for it. Linda Cooper has been finding it in places like Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area, still at this within the last few years. But it's relatively uncommon now in the central part of the state, even though it was probably once fairly abundant. And so the iNaturalist records are really much sparser with it. And I showed some examples of, we actually find it in Polk and Highlands County in cutthroat grass habitats many times. And so in the center is just the yellow dot shows the spatial distribution of one population, which had 1,565 flowering Platanthera ciliaris in 1 year. And that's the largest one I know of in Florida. A little more rare than that is Platanthera cristata. You notice the iNaturalist records now stop at about Clay and Putnam counties and don't go any farther south, but yet it is known from Central Florida. Enough that I wrote down, made a little list of which counties and when I think it was last seen in those counties. Is it in Orange County still? I really don't know. It could be out in the eastern part of the county and no one has made an intensive search for it at the right time. It doesn't come up every year, which makes these types of orchids are being challenging because they can actually have what's called prolonged or periodic dormancy, where they will stay below ground or vegetative for several years at a time before doing mass flowering. So we've had to hurriedly hunt for these, but because I put out the word about this and had people look for it and made them aware it was rare in the Central Florida, within the last 4 years, there have been 3 new counties found by people going out and just doing wildflower searches. So people are going out and looking for wildflowers, they're finding county records of orchids. So it's possible to find new things that haven't been found before without knowing every species in the flora. It's not always just the grasses and sedges that are the rare plants. Platanthera conspicua becomes a little less common than that. So Platanthera conspicua, if you look at the little county range map on the left, does show several counties in Central Florida where there's Platanthera conspicua records. But again, if I look at the recent records in iNaturalist, there's nothing south of the Osceola National Forest in Peninsular Florida. Yet the picture I've taken there of it and of the habitat is in Highlands County. So it is still here. And it was in Central Florida fairly recently in several counties. In the book, The Native Orchids of Florida, Lure has several pictures of this that were taken in Manatee County. And we have no record of it in Manatee County anytime in the last 50 years now. Going a little rarer, we go to Platanther Integra. Now my iNaturalist map, notice the range map does show Central Florida. It's got a little cluster of 4 counties there: Orange, Osceola, Polk, and Highlands. There are specimens, there are specimens to document all of those counties, but only 1 or 2 times each ever. One site in Polk, 2 sites in Highlands, 1 site in Osceola, and maybe 2 sites in Orange. And the orange sites were near Christmas in the 1960s. So it may still be there, but this is a very seepage dependent, tiny flowered but beautiful orchid. Again, my pictures are from Highlands County, where it is still persistent. So I went through this Platanthera. I actually left out one. I left out Platanthera flava because I didn't have photographs of it, because it doesn't occur where I'm surveying plants. It occurs in the more rich hydric hammocks from about here northward. And certainly most of it over in the Chasowitska area is where it's easiest to find it, but you probably could find Platanthera flava in maybe even Seminole or Orange County. I think I have found it there, come to think. I found it in northern Polk. I just didn't have a picture. Then some plants reach their northern range limit in Peninsular Florida and are really rare when you go north of that range. One of those is Euploca Polyphylla. This was long known as the name Heliotropium polyphyllum, so you'll know you're talking about the same plant. It's been split from the genus Heliotropium. When I look at its iNaturalist records, you can see that there's many in South Florida. Matter of fact, the IRC ranks it as 5 secure in South Florida, but yet it's fairly localized in Central Florida. It's not that you can't find it, but it's not a part of your common everyday flora of most natural areas you go to. Since this is so conspicuous, how many have seen this in Orange or Osceola counties? I haven't either, actually. So I do see it in southern Polk, which is where there's a couple records there. But yep, there's some records there. There's a record from somebody's finding it. This is another calciphile that likes high pH soils. And so it goes up the Big Bend coast into its northern limit in Dixie and Taylor County. So again, I'd rank that as rarer as you go north, and maybe not even present in the Panhandle. This I just put up based on the fact that we found it in the field, or Brett found it in the field actually a few weeks ago, and then I saw it last week. Desmodium Tenuafolia. Now, there's a lot of desmodiums, but they're actually, many of them are some are weedy and some are really specific to high quality natural areas. And I believe this is one of those. It's only known from, I guess the specimen records are Sarasota, Hillsborough, Pasco, Orange, Volusia in Central Florida. Well, our new site is Polk County. Even though I already had some records for Polk County hasn't technically been vouchered yet. When I looked at the iNaturalist records, there were very few for the entire state. Yet it was easy to identify by these narrow, drooping down leaves in kind of a mesic flatwoods habitat. And it had
What species?
Desmodium tenuafolia.
Tenuafolia.
Yeah. Again, there aren't a lot of records. So I don't know if this is really rare yet or not, but I suspect that I'll give it the benefit of the doubt is probably being rare unless we can prove that it's common in enough places. And then we'll get into how we're going to do that in a bit. And this one lost its name at the top with the covering up. So what is this picture of? Ah, it's this picture of Astragalus villosus. Astragalus villosus is a pretty narrow ranging plant in the Southeast in general, occurring south as far as Lake and Hernando counties, but it's only had relatively few county observations in recent years. So the only ones that are within the last 20 years are in Lake and Hernando. So this is probably pretty rare in Central Florida, but we're not really certain yet. If it's common anywhere, it'd probably be somewhere in the sandhills of Citrus and Hernando counties, where there's more habitat maybe than there is in this local region. And if there's no specimen record for Orange, but it's something to keep a lookout for. These little astragalus are very specialized plants because this is typically a Western US genus that only has a few endemic species in the Southeast and is otherwise not very diverse and almost absent from most of the region. One of the other ones that's very similar to that is Astragalus obcordatus, which is almost a Florida endemic, except for one, it really is in Alabama. Although it was hard to believe that at first. I looked at the specimen. This only has a couple recent records in all of Central Florida. One that I need to figure out which county was. It said with Lacucci, which I'm assuming was either Citrus Hernando in 2020, and a couple people found it in 2019 in Lake County, and Jared Brown found it just a few weeks ago. I think that was I realized that post doesn't say it was Lake County; it just says near Apopka. Was that Lake or Orange? Orange. Well, Orange would be a new county record. So there's never been reported before for Orange County. Okay. So we do have a new county record from someone in the room within the last few weeks of a globally rare plant. So this is G3, so it's globally threatened and state threatened. And again, I would say that this is common in no region. People find it a little more around Tallahassee than they do here. I see quite a few pictures of this that come from Wakulla and Leon counties, but not very many from elsewhere in the state. And then I threw in a couple others that now you can't even read the title of the plant that is of concern here is Calopogon multiflorus. Calopogon multiflorus is an orchid, and these are its distribution records. Notice on the iNaturalist distribution records, there's a big blob in Central Florida there. So people are finding this, but it is ranked as globally endangered and state endangered. I think it's listed as state threatened. So it's not technically listed officially as endangered, but G2S2 would indicate globally imperiled, state imperiled. Is about 2004, there was a range-wide status report done on this species, and they found that there are 64 sites known, 56 of them in Florida, and then hardly anything outside the state. And Florida contains the greatest number of populations with an estimated 6,000 individuals total. And that's still there as the information that's provided for Calopogon multiflorus. Well, I'm gonna continue on that species, dig a little deeper. Okay, at the top left, it's cut off a little bit. You can see those iNaturalist records in the top left, and that zoomed in a little bit more for Central Florida, and it has really been being found in Eastern Orange and Osceola counties recently. And I think that's because people are looking right after fire, which is when you have to look for this species. We did a study, and my colleagues did a study of this on Avon Park Air Force Range. And so we have several populations there, which is the lower left. And then we looked at how we define those in terms of spatial extent, going from what we call a macro population on the left and to a population level to a subpopulation to a colony. And then we estimated how many we had. And as of April 4th, we went over 50,000 individuals counted on Avon Park. But this is ranked G2. So to really accommodate how common it is in Central Florida, that has to be changed to at least a G3, because it's not as rare as range wide as people thought it was because of its abundance in Central Florida. And when you're looking at the right time of year, even without seeing the whole photo, you can see that there's not just one or two of them. And this would be at about 15 to 18 days post-burn in just a standard run-of-the-mill mesic pine savanna, where it's no specialized soil type, no specialized microhabitat. It's just a common member of the community that lies dormant for about 99% of the time. And then for about 10 or 15 days, every 4 to 5 years, you get to see it above ground. Another one that can be kind of like that, but does persist a little more on roadsides, is Zephranthus simpsonii. Again, ranked as globally G2 and S2 for Florida, so globally and state imperiled. But 44 of the total of all 9 of the 59 iNaturalist observations are in Central Florida. So there's more of it, by far more in this region than anywhere else in its range. And that's reflected by the concentration of those maps. And again, this is one that also is fire stimulated for flowering. And we have at Avon Park about 2,000 individuals marked, and there probably are more than that. Again, this is one I'd probably expect in quite a number of natural areas in eastern Orange and Osceola and in Brevard County. And again, what it looks like in flower. In this case, I think it's covered up, but I think this was 24 days after fire. I believe this was 20 or 22 days. This was 22 days post-burn when it's coming into peak flower, and with another fire on the horizon. Then we'll go into some more difficult or hard to identify species. This is Ringhospora elegantha, a sedge, but a very specific one that is very fidel to open herbaceous seepage slopes. It's fairly common in the Florida Panhandle, so you do get quite a few locations for it there. In Central Florida, it's found only in a narrow band in Polk and Highlands, probably, and only about less than 10 sites, but I think 6 sites still have it. And in Northeast Florida, just a few counties, but not seen very often, probably only seen in a few sites in the last 20 years. So this is G4S3. It's ranked 1 in Central, 1 in North, and 3 in the Panhandle. And again, this was just an example of data sources used to do that. I looked at all the specimen records to see how often these were being found. There were like 85 specimens collected ever from Florida that are digitized, 24 of those at USF, and I think I collected about half of them. Then you can look at plants by habitat types. In this case, this is just an example of sorting by habitat types. This is compiling species lists from around 200 or 300 sites and looking at which species were present in each habitat. And even though, you know, some were very common, some were widespread over many habitats, in which case they have records in most of the columns, whereas others were very specific, only having records in a few of these columns. These were very finely split community types, where you, on the scale where you'd probably have 500 communities for the state if you split them this fine. Then a plant which can be actually very rare in one region can be common in another. Morella carolinensis, the wide-leaved bayberry or wax, the evergreen bayberry or southern bayberry or whatever, formerly known as Myrica heterophylla, is quite rare in Central Florida again. I thought there was a record from Lake County, but apparently there's not. Okay, it's Marion and Putnam and Polk and Highlands. So this is a 5 in the Panhandle. It's actually, you see masses of it in seepage slopes and in just wet roadsides driving through mixed with tie-tie. And the iNaturalist records reflect that you only get it in the northern part of the state. But it's a Central Florida 1. So it goes from being extremely rare in one region to very common in another of the state. And its distribution at Avon Park is represented by the yellow triangles with the Seepage Slope Seepage Slope Landscape Association as the crosshatch area, which it almost is completely confined to. And it's growing in these low shrubs within cutthroat grass communities. So how do I do these surveys in order to compile all this information? This is getting into methodology, but it's really like anyone could do this just by organizing and collecting their data and compiling it into lists from where they go. I basically have a system where I name and code surveys so that I can retrieve them by searching for strings of characters within those codes, or by looking for the species themselves. So the left was like a list of habitat codes I was using for one region. And then on the right is how I would combine that into a list for the whole site. Now I'm going to show you that in an example. First, I'll just show that is then, I then enter that into relational database format in order to be able to store this in first normal format and be able to easily update and keep everything cross-linked to reference tables of all the names and their characteristics, the sites and their characteristics, the larger sites and their information. This also is used to automatically generate herbarium labels, it turns out, if I collect from the same database as the floristic data is done. So how do I'm going to use that to build a flora from small to larger areas. In this case, my little thing, yeah, I'm starting by looking and surveying this polygon here that's called D5 on this vegetation map, which is the Calcareous fringing wet prairie. It's one of the most diverse community types in the state, and with a very large species pool, both at individual sites and at sites in total. When I looked at 4 microhabitats within that code D5 and combined them, I got 244 species from just this zone that I've marked here. So it's 244 species in that. Then I looked to see how many species I add as I add adjacent habitats. So you know about, like, diversity is a function both of the diversity within a particular small spot, then the diversity of your landscape conditions. So the many different microhabitats or habitat types you have in a particular area, the more likely you are to have a larger number of species. In this case, right above this, I go into a typical mesic flatwoods, which had species that weren't present in the calcareous wet prairie, and I'm up to 280 species by the time I get through that. Then let's add this wetter one next here to it, where it's a wet savanna, and I'm adding several more. Then this species in this depression marsh were present, this acidic depression marsh, Hypericum fasciculatum zone dominated, were not present in any of those other communities. So by the time I've added that and added finally 2 species I add by going into the maiden cane zone in the center that weren't present anywhere else in that landscape. Probably Pontidaria was one of them. I'm up to 307 species in just part of the area you can see on the screen at a scale where you're basically seeing all the way across it as you're looking at the landscape, and you're walking maybe 200 or 300 meters. Then in the process of just doing that survey, I found 2 plants that were of interest. One is Digitarius Subcalva, which this was only the 4th time it had been seen in the world. The type specimen is from near Plant City. It has these very, very fuzzy stoloniferous leaves and creeps through the lower grass vegetation, and then very thin, narrow spikelets. It's G1S1, Central Florida 1, endemic to Central Florida. So it's known only from Hillsborough and Polk counties. And Spiranthes igniorchis was also present in that same site. Was described as a new species from Polk County in 2017. Similar in many characteristics to Spiranthes longilabris, but flowers in August, and then DNA confirmed that it's genetically distinct from Spiranthes longilabris. As soon as it was published, within probably 2 or 3 weeks, a friend of mine found it in Okeechobee County by looking at the same habitats. And at Kissimmee Prairie State Preserve, they have similar habitats, and he was able to find it in almost the same type of habitat a few miles away, but in a different county. So it's now not just a Polk County endemic. So going back to my one area there, it was this area down here where I'm right here was where I was just surveying, and that all combined became my survey site, Polk 259BM, and I had 307 species. Well, then I start looking at what was present in adjacent areas that I surveyed. I surveyed this one and added a few, then all these over on this side, and then I sort of did it in order where I came up here and looked at what was present in this polygon, then this one, and I'm still adding species. I come over here and I jump and add a bunch more because I get into a very different habitat. In this case, all of the tree canopies you're seeing are Nyssa, swamp black gum, Nyssa biflora. So I'm in a deep Nyssa swamp here in the middle of a basin marsh, and I'm finding many species that weren't present in this surrounding landscape. And so by the time I get through what's shown on the map, which is about a square kilometer, let's say, I'm at 371 species. Then expand it out further. So I've been looking down here at this area. Then I go and I add the species present in these polygons. It turns out a whole bunch of different things. Oh, you can't see mine. Oh, there I am. I was off the screen. Because I now encounter a set of hammock forests. So all the species of the hammocks, the species that required the dense shade of natural hardwood hammocks, weren't present in this more open fire-frequented landscape or in the swamps. I'm getting the things like the Psychotria and Ardisia now. And many of the ground cover species are coming into that, as well as some epiphytes. So now by the time I go through that list of species, I'm up at 409. I continue to move out. And so all of what I've been doing so far has just been in about this area, right here. About, at the landscape scale, just one part of this, what I'm calling the Osceola Plain natural subsection, the Loamy Circumneutral Flatlands Landscape Association. When I look at what's present in just that polygon, part of that polygon 1B, I'm now up to 488 species when I add in sites that were not in that first map. Then we'll zoom out a little further. So now the area I was just looking at is right here. And now I'm looking at all of the landscape associations of Avon Park Air Force Range, including the central bombing range ridge that goes through the center of the landscape there, and through many areas of mesic flatwoods of various types in both in the Kissimmee River Valley and over to Lake Arbuckle. And I'm up to 1,183. It took around 2,000 of those individual species lists to build the flora by habitat type and by specific site location up to that 1,183 species. But that can be done in any physiographic section or region of the state if you compile the local floras, which if you have local floras that are tied to specific locations or to specific sites, they can be compiled in that way, such that they could say what plants are known from the Winter Haven Ridge, or what plants are known from the Mount Dora Ridge, by looking to see which areas are found only within those, and particularly if they're specific sites that we know are on those landscapes, and are they different? How many species are present on one or another? How many species have been lost from one, but still present on the other? For instance, let's say the Winter Haven Ridge may have once had as many species, many of the same species as the Lake Wales Ridge, but it may be very difficult to find many of those anymore in the more developed landscape. And of course, you can do that with any part of the state in terms of looking at the physiography and looking at the floras of those physiographic regions. And we can still go out and collect, we won't never finish kind of collecting this information. There's always more to do. So these are surveys that Brett Budak did on January the 9th in just a small part of the Lake Wales Bridge Wildlife and Environmental area at the Royce Ranch unit, in which case he marked which polygons that he visited and did a species list within each polygon, of each one of which is a single natural community type. Well, those can then be added to and compared to our natural community type lists, as well as being part of building the flora of that particular site by many different small surveys that can be linked together and can be relooked. You know where they saw it. So if there's a doubt, you can go back to the same area and check on it. So this is a way, going back to iNaturalist, this is a way I'm using iNaturalist projects because it's collecting that information. So for instance, Plants of Highlands in Polk Counties, Florida has 27,000 records, and I can look to see what's most common. And I just decided to do a little side search on that over on the right panel and say what dicyntheliums are known from Polk and Highlands counties and how often has each one been seen. There were 26 of them have been reported from Polk and Highlands counties on iNaturalist, which is more than were known from the flora of the state. So I'm wanting to be compiling towards doing this flora, all these different types of data sets. This says published floristic lists as one example. And what I've been doing is going through and taking published floristic lists and turning them into spreadsheet format so that are the same spreadsheet format for each one, so that I can add those to my database. And that's an example of what that looks like when I finish on the left, where I've taken someone's thesis, in this case, a thesis done for an area in Pasco County, and by habitat type, they did their flora. And so I've got it organized by those habitat types. I can link those to habitat type codes and then say, okay, in Mesic Flatwoods of Pasco County, we have this list of species reported. And again, I did an iNaturalist project for the particular same area, and already 500 observations of plants have shown up there. And that's only a small part of the areas getting covered. So we'll probably add a lot to that published flora by looking at the iNaturalist records from the same area. And there's also a lot of unpublished, is the word that's not there, floristic lists for counties, conservation areas, and smaller sites. For instance, most state parks and state wildlife management areas have species lists of plants in their management plans. So you can look at those and see what's been reported for the particular area. You can use it to guide what to look for, or what you'd like to try to find or verify that was known from there, or what's not known that you want to add to it. Most of the state forests don't have that, however, and so we're having to work with those pretty much from scratch. And of course, there's what Florida Native Plant Society chapters have done in terms of their compilation of data from species lists, field trip species lists. And if they go back to the same area many times, some chapters have compiled lists for conservation areas in the region. For instance, the Flora of Occolockonee River State Park is primarily a Sarracenia chapter compilation. They just keep going, when they're going to that, they keep looking for and trying to add to that species list, and have over 500 from that property. The Magnolia chapter, which is the one on the left, has actually done many of these. Primarily, Lauren Anderson did most of them, but there's others where other people cooperated in terms of like helping work on a list of a specific conservation area, and particularly using that as an example because he made his spreadsheets of the information that he had for each of the natural areas that he was working in available to the chapter. So we're using a lot of integrated floristic relational databases in order to finish this type of project. At Avon Park, we have the largest single floristic database that I know of in the state. We have, for those plants in a polygon, we have about 64,000 from about 2,000 now, probably more than that. 71,000 species cover records, 60,000 rare plant GPS points, and the vegetation mapping is done at the level of detail that we have 7,464 polygons mapped. So we can actually use those as subdivisions of where we're looking. Outside of that, for Central Florida, I have about 43,000 digitized records, 38,000 in the Panhandle, and not as many in North Florida. And I haven't attempted to duplicate the South Florida one because it's another large one, the IRC one, that I don't see any reason to have to redo, but simply to add information to what they have. I put out a call for people to help on this type of project a few weeks ago on my Facebook page, Florida Flora and Ecosystematics. And within a few days, we got about 50 people who said they can help survey the flora of a local area near where they live. And so I organized those by county, so you only see part of them on here, but people have actually jumped at the idea that they could go out and do a survey, and it would be part of something else that's using that information to try to understand how common or how rare in the distribution of all the plants of the state. So we need a lot of those in order to do this. It's going to take a lot of looking to see if things are still present that were historical. With that, I think I've given you an idea of what might be involved in doing this type of project and what some of my scope of it is. And I could entertain some questions if we have time about what ideas you have based on that. Yes.
My question was back to the coefficient, and I was wondering if that is being calculated just averaging the number of observations, or how?
It's more of a judgment call about where those observations are. So if those observations are all in high quality natural areas, there could be a lot of them and it still be very high coefficient of community. But if we're seeing that like let's say 2/3 of the observations were on the roadside, on roadsides, or in disturbed fields, or in things like that, I can look at those locations as to where people are, or in people's yards that didn't plant them, of course. I can look at those and say those species are secure and getting around and are not indicative of a high quality natural area, even though they might also be present in those there. One way that one of the founders of that methodology said is a 1 means that only 10% of the time you see it, it's in a natural area. A 10 means 100% of the time you see it, it's in a natural area, and somewhere in between.
Is that going off by reference posts, or is that from botanists going out?
It'd be botanists actually going out and looking at, you know, we know what kind, it's almost like we know what's in the really high quality natural areas, but sometimes we don't know how well those species are doing in disturbed areas unless we go look. Like we went into a fairly disturbed area this morning and we still found like maybe let's say 60 species in a mesic flatwoods, but we didn't find 100 like we're used to seeing. Which ones were missing and why were they missing? That would be if you had like, let's say 50 of replicates of that, we would know which ones are consistently missing when an area is more disturbed. Yes.
From Zoom, if someone wants to join one of the volunteers, how do you
Are they on Facebook? If they're on Facebook, go to my Florida Flora and Ecosystematics page. Florida Flora and Ecosystematics. You'd have to search for and you'd find, hopefully, and join the group. And then there's a what's it called, a pinned post at the top about this subject, and just answer it and say where you're interested in, what you're interested in doing, what kinds of areas you go to, what kind of records you may already have. Well, I'm not looking at the camera. You're out there, aren't you?
How many plants that we talked about tonight might see on the field trip on Saturday?
A few.
Exciting.
A few. I wish we could actually take the field trip to Avon Park, but it's a hunting day, and we don't really like to mix wildflower enthusiasts with hunters if we could help it.
We have a question from Zoom. Sean Patton says he does Habitat Restoration in Florida. Is there any way you can use this information to help restore more rare or endangered species? Conservation can only go so far, and restoration is becoming more vital for different habitat.
Yes, and I'd say one way he could use it is once we get this information together, it can be a way to look at restoration success, because if those more restricted species, if you can get those established, then you're more likely to have something that'll eventually resemble a natural community. And it'll have that diversity of specific species to that community and not just generalists that happen to be anywhere on the landscape with that same soil hydrology, which is really what restoration sometimes just has to start with. You have to get something there, and then you try to get the plants that will then take advantage of those conditions.
I have a question about, so with the iMac stuff that you're looking at, that's available to anybody, so that the locations of all those?
Yes,
Okay.
those are available. The poster has the control over how much they make available. So you can choose to obscure your locations or not. You can choose whether to put them into a project where the curator of that project can see the locations, even if the public can't. And those are specifically spelled out in the projects. And sometimes it'll ask you that. And so if you join a project, that's one of the things you can actually do instead of just your observations showing up as just because they fall within the boundary of the project. If you join the project, then they're compiled more as your observations as part of the flora of that project, and the curator of the project can see more about it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.